Zeke sat quietly on the park bench, but Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle had no idea who they were messing with. They mocked him for his skin, until the billionaire revealed his true power. Like, share, and subscribe to see how he flipped everything. Zeke had always moved through life quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow that knew its own strength. At 72, his pace was slow but deliberate, each step measured, each glance calm and observant. Most people walking through Willow Creek Park would have seen only an old black man sitting on a worn wooden bench beneath a spreading oak, his eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses, his hands folded over a cane that had long since stopped needing support. But Zeke's life was anything but ordinary. He rose early before the sun even thought to stretch across the horizon. His mornings began with a ritual, tea steeped perfectly at 178 degrees Fahrenheit, a slice of whole-grain toast, and a few minutes of newspaper reading. Though most of the world's headlines were redundant to him, Zeke had made his fortune decades ago, building a tech empire from nothing but persistence and vision. He had watched empires rise and fall, economies collapse and recover, and yet he remained a quiet observer, preferring the simplicity of his routines to the noise of the high-rise offices and boardrooms he once commanded. Despite his wealth, Zeke had never changed the rhythm of his life for comfort or status. His house, though enormous and modern, looked more like a comfortable home than a mansion. Art pieces adorned the walls, but only the ones he had personally chosen, each telling a story of a life spent understanding the world's complexities. Every morning he made his way to Willow Creek Park, not because he needed to be seen, but because the park offered a sense of ordinary life that even money couldn't buy. The laughter of children, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the wind. It reminded him of his youth, of simpler times, of lessons learned when life had yet to shape him into the man he was today. On this particular day, the sky was a soft gray, threatening rain but never committing. Zeke wore his usual ensemble, a charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and polished shoes that gleamed despite their age. On his head rested a simple black flat cap, tilted slightly forward, shielding his eyes from the early morning chill. As he settled on his favorite bench, he adjusted his glasses and exhaled slowly, watching the world move around him. The park was quiet at first, as it always was in these early hours. Joggers passed with headphones and determined expressions. A young couple walked their small dog, tossing a frisbee across the dewy grass. Zeke observed them all with the patience of a man who had seen every type of human behavior imaginable. He had grown accustomed to people ignoring him, to assuming his life was simple, even unimportant. Few ever guessed the truth. That morning, however, the park's usual calm was about to be disrupted. From the distant path leading to the oak grove, a trio of teenage boys approached, Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle. They were loud, carrying the kind of energy only teenagers could muster, laughing at jokes that seemed louder than necessary, their sneakers scuffing the gravel as they drew nearer. They didn't notice Zeke at first, as most people didn't. But when they did, their laughter sharpened, like a predator recognizing something to torment. Ryan, the tallest of the three, stopped first. He leaned slightly toward his friends, smirking. "Look at this guy," he whispered, loud enough for the other two to hear. "Sitting here all serious. What is he even doing?" Ethan and Kyle leaned in, eyes narrowing. They weren't thinking about him as a person, just another target, someone to mock for the thrill of it. They didn't know his story, his life, or the billions that quietly followed him like an invisible shadow. To them, he was old, slow, black, and therefore easy game. Zeke noticed them, of course, but he did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or make a show of his awareness. He simply observed as he always did, letting their energy wash over him like a fleeting wave. He had encountered bullies before, not in this park, perhaps, but in life. Life had a way of teaching lessons quietly, without unnecessary spectacle. He smiled faintly, as though amused by their ignorance. Ryan stepped closer, trying to appear intimidating, though his movements were clumsy and uncoordinated. "Hey, old man," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "You lost or something?" Kyle snickered, elbowing Ethan, who was now crouched slightly, mimicking a sneer. "Yeah, Grandpa," he added. This bench isn't for people like you. Move it along. Zeke's hands remained folded over his cane. He didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to study them, to measure the distance between their arrogance and their understanding of the world. He could have reacted in a dozen ways, angry, dismissive, even humiliating, but that wasn't his style. He preferred subtlety. The strength of a person, he had learned long ago, was not always in how loudly they made themselves heard, but in how quietly they carried it. The boys, misunderstanding his silence for fear, grew bolder. Kyle leaned over the bench, grinning. "You scared or something? Come on, say something." It was in that moment, watching their reckless confidence, that Zeke's mind wandered, not to revenge, not yet, but to reflection. He remembered his youth in a neighborhood much like this one. The taunts, the sneers, the small cruelties designed to remind a person of their place. He remembered the humiliation he had endured, yes, but also the determination it had sparked in him. Every insult, every shove, every unfair glance had become a brick in the foundation of his future. And now, decades later, the tables had quietly turned, but Zeke would not reveal that just yet. For now, he remained the quiet old man, the one they thought they could provoke. He adjusted his cap slightly, letting the shadow cover more of his face. And in that small movement, there was a presence, a weight, an unspoken warning. He was not as powerless as they assumed. The boys, meanwhile, continued their taunts, oblivious to the reality of the man before them. Ryan picked up a small stone and rolled it along the ground. "Hey, old man, can you even see me?" he taunted, laughing. Ethan joined in, mimicking a dramatic feint, as if Zeke's mere presence was too much for him to handle. Kyle, always the loudest, shouted, "Move it, Grandpa, or we'll move you!" Zeke's eyes behind the gold rims were calm. He didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't speak. He simply watched, calculating, remembering, and understanding. He thought of the young men as they were, arrogant, naive, brimming with misplaced confidence, and he remembered the same arrogance he had once carried in his own youth. The difference now was experience, patience, and the quiet power of a life well lived. Around them, the park carried on, indifferent to the unfolding interaction. A jogger passed, nodding politely at Zeke. The couple with the dog continued their game, unaware of the drama taking place under the oak tree. The wind whispered through the leaves, a gentle reminder that life moved forward, whether or not humans noticed. As the boys prepared for their next move, Zeke finally spoke, not in anger, not in threat, but in a calm voice that carried the weight of decades of life experience. "Boys," he said, simple and measured, "you might want to rethink your choices." The words barely registered at first. They expected fear, outrage, anything that would confirm their assumptions. Instead, they got quiet. A small pause, the kind that unsettles without effort. They exchanged uncertain glances, trying to figure out if this man was truly harmless or if there was something else beneath the calm exterior. And that was enough for Zeke. For now, he let them stew in their ignorance, letting the seeds of curiosity and unease take root. They would learn eventually. They would see that life is rarely what it seems, and that people, quiet people, patient people, often wield the most power. This was the beginning. The old man on the bench, the billionaire hidden behind ordinary clothes and an ordinary life, had entered the park not for confrontation but for peace. Yet, in his quiet way, he had already begun shaping the lesson these boys would one day remember. Zeke took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs. He watched the leaves shimmer in the slight breeze. Life was always moving, always changing, and today, as the boys prepared to push the limits of their arrogance, it would change for them too. Not violently, not recklessly, but inevitably. And Zeke, he would be ready. The boys didn't realize it at first, but something in Zeke's calm, measured voice had unsettled them. Ryan, always the leader of the trio, blinked rapidly, trying to mask the brief uncertainty. Ethan shuffled nervously behind him, while Kyle, the loudest and most reckless, smirked, though his bravado lacked its usual confidence. None of them knew it yet, but they had just crossed the invisible line between youthful arrogance and genuine consequence. "Come on, guys," Ryan whispered, trying to recover. He's just an old man, don't freak out. But Zeke didn't respond immediately. He remained seated, the cane resting against his knee, hands folded calmly over it, eyes hidden but sharp. The silence stretched, and in that stillness, the boys felt the first twinge of doubt. There was a weight to this man, something they couldn't see, couldn't measure, but could feel. It wasn't fear, it was the instinctive recognition that they were overstepping. Kyle, unable to tolerate silence, stepped closer, leaning toward Zeke with a mocking grin. "I said move it, Grandpa," he taunted, poking the air near Zeke's shoulder. "Or we'll move you ourselves." Zeke finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You think you're stronger than me because you're loud, but strength isn't always measured in noise." The boys froze. Something about the calm authority in his tone made them pause. For the first time, they sensed that Zeke wasn't just an old man. They were standing in front of someone who had weathered storms they couldn't imagine, someone who had endured far more than petty park bullies. Yet, they dismissed it quickly, shaking off the unease like an itch. "Whatever, man," Ryan said, forcing a laugh. "You old people are always so serious. Chill out." Zeke leaned back slightly, letting the brim of his cap shadow his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone began to shift the dynamic. He could feel their arrogance cracking, the subtle tremors of uncertainty that always preceded true understanding. "You think I'm serious now," Zeke said, "but I've seen arrogance like yours before. I've seen it fail. I've seen it crumble under the weight of reality. And reality, boys, is patient." Kyle snorted, a forced, uneasy laugh. "Yeah, right. You're just an old dude with a fancy suit. What are you gonna do? Call the cops?" Zeke's eyes gleamed faintly behind the lenses of his glasses, and for the first time, a smile flickered across his face. Not a cruel smile, not a mean one, but a knowing smile. The kind that comes from understanding exactly how the story will unfold, long before anyone else sees it. "You'll understand soon enough," he said softly. Patience has a way of teaching lessons better than force ever could. The boys exchanged confused looks. Ryan kicked at a patch of gravel, unsettled by the calm authority in Zeke's tone. Ethan fidgeted, glancing nervously at the path leading out of the park, while Kyle crossed his arms, trying to appear defiant, but clearly feeling the tension. Zeke leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and continued. "You think this is just a game, don't you? You think this park is yours to command, that the world bends to your laughter. But life doesn't work that way. Life has a way of surprising people. Sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who change everything." The boys, still standing, felt an unspoken pressure building. It wasn't fear of him striking or using brute force. They weren't yet afraid of physical danger. It was the sense that Zeke had already anticipated every move, every insult, every sneer. The very air seemed to weigh heavier around him. And in that heaviness, they felt small, exposed, as if the park itself had shifted to observe them. Kyle laughed nervously. "You're crazy, man. Just crazy." "Crazy," Zeke echoed, his tone almost thoughtful. "Perhaps. But sometimes crazy is simply the word people use for those who think differently, who refuse to be intimidated by ignorance. And sometimes, that kind of crazy is what makes all the difference." At that moment, a gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wet grass and earth. The sound was ordinary, but it punctuated Zeke's words, as though nature itself had paused to underscore his point. The boys, untrained in subtlety, felt the shift in their environment but couldn't place it. Ryan, trying to regain his composure, stepped forward again. "All right, man," he said, voice a notch louder, trying to mask the unease creeping in. "We're just messing around. No harm done, right?" Zeke remained still. He let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "You think this is harmless," he said, voice calm but piercing. But every action carries a consequence. Every insult, every shove, every laugh at someone else's expense. It comes back in ways you can't predict. The boys looked at one another. Ethan shuffled his feet, while Kyle's smirk faltered slightly. Something in Zeke's demeanor made them aware that they were no longer in control. And, Zeke continued, some lessons are taught quietly, subtly, without screaming, without visible force. You may not see it now, but you will remember it. A small crowd of park-goers began to gather at a distance, not because of the confrontation, but because the morning was busying. Joggers, dog walkers, and parents with strollers passed, glancing curiously at the trio and the old man. The boys noticed the stares and felt a new pressure, embarrassment, the subtle public scrutiny they had always avoided. Ryan whispered something to Ethan and Kyle, though Zeke didn't catch the words. It was clear, their confidence was waning. The arrogance that had brought them together to mock a man they assumed was powerless was now cracking. They didn't know why, only that the dynamic had shifted in a way they didn't understand. Zeke adjusted his flat cap and looked out across the park, his eyes scanning the morning activity. He didn't need to raise his voice or threaten them physically. The shift had already begun, and he allowed himself a small private satisfaction, knowing that their ignorance was giving him time, space, and opportunity to set the next phase into motion. The first tangible act of defiance came from Ryan. Frustrated by the silence and Zeke's calm, he grabbed a discarded soda can and tossed it near the bench, letting it clatter against the wooden planks. "There, happy now?" he shouted. Zeke's eyes didn't move from the boys, but his smile widened faintly. "Yes," he said softly. "That's exactly what I needed to see. Your impatience, your arrogance. It tells me everything." Kyle laughed nervously, trying to regain dominance. "See? He's scared. He's just old and—" Zeke cut him off, voice calm but heavy. "No, Kyle, I am not scared. But you are revealing your weaknesses for all to see." The boys froze, realizing that their attempts to provoke him were failing. Every taunt, every laugh, every shove had done nothing but expose them. For the first time, the power dynamic was clear. Zeke was no ordinary man, and they had underestimated him. And yet, Zeke still did not reveal the most important truth, the secret that would soon turn their world upside down. The billions he had quietly amassed, the influence he wielded behind the scenes, the power that could change lives with a single decision. They were all hidden behind his calm exterior. He allowed them to feel dominance for now, letting their arrogance feed the lesson that was coming. The boys, increasingly unsettled, began to bicker among themselves. "We can't just back off," Kyle whispered. "We can't look weak in front of everyone here." Ryan, his voice lower now, said, "Maybe we should. Maybe we pushed too far." Ethan nodded hesitantly, still shuffling his feet. The conflict among them mirrored the growing tension with Zeke, internal struggles, arrogance confronting reality, youth meeting patience. Zeke, observing all of it, felt a quiet satisfaction. He could have humiliated them outright, revealed his fortune, or used physical intimidation. But that wasn't the lesson he intended to teach. Not yet. The best lessons he had learned long ago came from careful orchestration, letting people confront their own ignorance before reality intervened. He leaned back on the bench, watching as the boys faltered, their bravado cracking under the weight of subtle authority and social scrutiny. A small child ran past, chasing a frisbee, and the laughter reminded Zeke of his own childhood. He had learned early that life was rarely fair, but that cleverness, patience, and understanding could shift the balance. And now, decades later, he was ready to apply the same principles, quietly, deliberately, and inevitably. By mid-morning, the tension had reached its peak. Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle, exhausted by the invisible pressure, stumbled toward a temporary retreat. Not defeat, not yet, but an acknowledgement that the simple, ordinary old man before them was more than he appeared. And Zeke? He sat calmly, adjusting his glasses, smiling faintly. The rising action had reached its crescendo, not with violence, not with overt confrontation, but with the subtle, invisible shift of power. The boys would not understand it yet, but soon, very soon, they would. Zeke took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. The park had become the stage for a lesson in humility, patience, and the quiet force of a life well lived. And in the shadows of his calm demeanor, the secret waited. Billionaire power, influence, and the inevitability of consequence, poised to remind the boys that arrogance, ignorance, and cruelty are always temporary, while wisdom endures. The next moments would come swiftly, reshaping their morning, their assumptions, and their understanding of the world. But for now, the boys were left to grapple with unease, curiosity, and the first taste of consequences they had not yet earned. The morning had stretched on longer than anyone expected. The sun now hung high over Willow Creek Park, filtering golden light through the leaves. But the warmth didn't reach the hearts of Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle. Their confidence had cracked. Every step they had taken toward mocking Zeke had been met not with fear or submission, but with a calm authority that unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate. Kyle kicked at a loose pebble, sending it skittering across the path. I don't get it, he muttered, voice shaky. Why aren't we scaring him? Why isn't he? Ryan held up a hand, trying to regain some semblance of control. We just need to leave, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ethan nodded weakly beside him. They had underestimated him from the start, and now the weight of that miscalculation pressed heavily on them. Zeke remained seated on the bench, his posture calm, hands folded over his cane. But there was a subtle shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tightening of energy. His eyes, sharp and unyielding behind gold-rimmed glasses, followed every twitch, every glance, every faltering motion of the boys. And then finally he spoke. Not in warning this time, but with a voice that carried power and consequence. You've tested patience, he said slowly, deliberately. You've mocked what you didn't understand. You've assumed weakness where there was none, and now, you're about to see the truth, the boys froze. The words weren't threatening, not in the way a yell or shove would be, but they hit harder than anything physical. There was authority in Zeke's tone, the kind that comes from a lifetime of commanding empires, shaping industries, and quietly influencing people without ever needing recognition. What truth? Kyle asked, his voice wavering. We get it, you're old, you're... Whatever, you're rich? Big deal. Zeke's smile widened faintly, a glimmer of amusement flickering behind his calm demeanor. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a slim black leather wallet. From it, he retrieved a sleek, polished card and held it out for the boys to see. This, he said, voice steady, is proof of what you assumed you couldn't see. I am not just an old man on a bench. I am a man who built a world, who created companies, who commands influence across continents. You thought you could mock me for my age, my skin, my quiet demeanor, but you failed to recognize the reality behind the facade. Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle stared at the card, disbelief flashing across their faces. Kyle's bravado faltered completely. No way, he whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the card, uncertain, almost afraid. Zeke leaned forward, placing the card on the bench between them. Read it carefully, he said, and understand that wealth, influence, and power are not just tools for luxury. They are instruments to reveal truth, to test arrogance, and to teach lessons that some people refuse to learn otherwise. The boys shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. For the first time, the scale of their misjudgment became clear. They hadn't just been mocking an old man, they had been laughing at someone whose life had already proven what their ignorance couldn't. Kyle swallowed hard. We didn't know, he said, his voice barely audible. We didn't. We just thought... Zeke raised a hand gently, stopping him. You thought wrong, he said. And that is the point. Life is rarely what it appears to be. You judged, you assumed, you attacked. And now you are confronted with reality, one that cannot be ignored. No matter how loudly you laugh or how confidently you stride, he stood slowly, cane in hand, and the sun caught the gold accents on his watch and glasses. To the boys, he appeared taller, larger, somehow commanding the space itself. He didn't need to raise his voice. The authority, the quiet certainty, radiated naturally, forcing them to step back without realizing it. You see, Zeke continued, money alone is not the measure of a person. Influence alone is not the measure. But knowledge, patience, and understanding, these are power beyond your imagining. You assumed you could bully me because you thought I was weak. You assumed your arrogance would shield you. You assumed wrongly. Ryan looked down, shame flickering across his features. Ethan fidgeted, unable to meet Zeke's gaze. Kyle remained silent, the bravado drained entirely. They felt small, not because of wealth, not because of status, but because they had been confronted with the undeniable truth of experience, wisdom, and moral authority. Zeke reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small notebook. He opened it to a page filled with notes, names, and figures, records of charitable work, foundations he had built, lives he had quietly changed. He flipped it slowly so they could see. I could crush you with legal action, social exposure, or influence, he said calmly. But that would teach nothing. Instead, I offer you something far rarer, the knowledge that arrogance, cruelty, and ignorance have consequences, and that people, no matter how they appear, are not always what they seem. The boys' faces were pale now, the earlier laughter completely gone. Kyle whispered almost to himself, We messed up. Yes, Zeke said. You did. But it's not too late to learn, to change, to understand that the world is bigger than your assumptions, and that respect, humility, and understanding matter more than fleeting dominance. He closed the notebook gently, replaced it in his blazer, and adjusted his flat cap. Now I suggest you leave the park, reflect on what you've done, and remember this moment, because it will not be repeated. The boys hesitated, then slowly began to retreat, heads bowed. Each step they took was heavier than the last, weighted with the realization of their misjudgment, the undeniable presence of a man they had underestimated, and the knowledge that the lesson they had just learned would stay with them forever. Zeke watched them go, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The rising action, the tension, the subtle game of dominance and understanding, it had reached its climax. The boys had been confronted not with anger, not with force, but with truth. And truth, as Zeke knew, always leaves an impression deeper than fear ever could. He returned to his bench, settling as he had that morning, hands folded over his cane. The park carried on around him, oblivious to the confrontation, yet changed subtly by the encounter. Children laughed, joggers passed, and the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sense of normalcy that had resumed, but now with a hidden undercurrent of consequence. Zeke's phone buzzed softly in his pocket, a reminder of meetings, investments, and the life he led quietly outside the park. But for now he remained, savoring the simple satisfaction of a lesson well taught. The boys had left with more than embarrassment. They carried the first seeds of understanding, humility and recognition of strength that comes from patience, wisdom, and moral courage. And as he sipped his tea, watching the sunlight dance across the dewy grass, Zeke allowed himself a small, private smile. Power, influence, and wealth were tools, but the real measure of a life well lived was the ability to teach, guide, and correct without hatred, without spectacle, and without unnecessary cruelty. Today had been a small victory, not of domination, but of truth. And truth, as Zeke understood better than anyone, was the most powerful force in the world. The park had regained its quiet rhythm, though the air still carried traces of tension, subtle and lingering. Children's laughter echoed faintly. Joggers passed with nods of polite recognition, and the scent of fresh grass and dewy earth reminded everyone of ordinary mornings. Yet something extraordinary had taken place beneath the spreading oak. The confrontation with Zeke, the old man they had mocked, underestimated and challenged, had left an imprint that would not fade easily. Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle walked slowly toward the park exit. Their heads were bowed, not in fear, but in the weight of realization. Each step was measured, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. For the first time, they were confronting not just the consequences of their actions, but the truth of their assumptions and the humbling recognition of the disparity between arrogance and wisdom. Did you see that? Kyle whispered, barely audible. His voice carried the tremor of disbelief, mixed with awe. He's a billionaire? Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. Yeah, and it wasn't just the money. It's the way he handled us. Calm, like nothing we could do even mattered. Ryan stayed quiet for a long moment, thinking. The initial shock was giving way to reflection, an internal reckoning that demanded more than a casual apology or shrug. We were idiots, he admitted finally. We judged him. We laughed at him. And we didn't even know who he was. The three of them walked the remaining distance in silence, each lost in thought. The park, ordinary as it seemed, had become a classroom. Zeke had not screamed, had not struck, had not humiliated them in front of others. He had simply been present, observant, patient. And in that patience, he had taught a lesson far more enduring than fear or anger ever could. Meanwhile, Zeke remained on his bench beneath the oak, watching them go. His posture was relaxed, but his mind was active, tracing the subtle shifts in behavior, the small but significant lessons they had begun to internalize. He had chosen restraint, allowing them to confront their own arrogance rather than forcing awareness upon them. It was the difference between a teacher who lectures and a teacher who inspires reflection. And Zeke knew that the latter left the deepest mark. As he sipped his tea, a young mother passed with her child, offering a friendly smile. Zeke returned it, the calm authority in his eyes tempered with kindness. Life, he reflected, was a series of lessons, some small, some vast, and some hidden behind the quiet exterior of ordinary days. This morning had been one such lesson, a reminder that appearances deceive, and that strength manifests in patience, insight, and moral courage rather than spectacle or force. Later that evening, Ryan sat in his room, replaying the encounter in his mind. He could not shake the feeling of humility that had settled over him, a quiet, persistent weight. He thought about the arrogance that had driven their actions, the assumptions they had made, and the way Zeke had handled it. It was unsettling, yes, but enlightening. For the first time, Ryan realized that strength and power were not always loud or visible. Sometimes, they were quiet, deliberate, and invisible to those who lacked the wisdom to see them. Kyle, too, sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The memory of Zeke's calm gaze and measured words haunted him, not as a threat, but as truth. He felt the sting of his ignorance, the humility of knowing that he had judged someone incorrectly, and the rare clarity of understanding that the world was larger, more complex and far richer in experience than he had imagined. Ethan, lying on his desk with his hands folded over his notebook, thought about his friends and the choices they had made. He felt remorse, not just for the embarrassment, but for the cruelty. And beneath that remorse, he felt a spark of growth, a recognition that people, places, and situations often carry depths unseen, waiting to reveal themselves to those willing to observe, listen, and reflect. The following days in school carried a subtle shift. The trio's interactions with others changed. They were quieter, more observant, less inclined to mock or belittle. Whispers of the park encounter traveled, though not in full detail. Classmates noticed a difference in their demeanor, a tempered confidence, a newfound awareness that arrogance could be costly. Though they never spoke openly of Zeke or the billionaire revelation, the memory of the lesson remained embedded in their consciousness, guiding their actions and choices. Meanwhile, Zeke returned to his usual routines with quiet grace. He visited the park, but now he walked a little farther before sitting, observing the world with the same calm presence, allowing life to continue around him. He met familiar joggers with a nod, exchanged smiles with passing children, and continued his quiet philanthropy, investment, and mentorship from behind the scenes. The morning encounter had been a small interruption, a ripple in the pond of his life, but one that reminded him that even subtle actions could have profound consequences. The park bench where he had sat remained as it always had, ordinary, unassuming yet touched by the extraordinary. It had become a stage not for spectacle, but for subtle education. For Zeke, the lesson of the day was complete. Patience, observation, and moral courage could shift even the most arrogant of hearts. The world would continue, oblivious to the ripple, but the impact was enduring. Weeks later, the boys found themselves in moments that required choices, moments that tested their arrogance and impulse. They remembered Zeke, the calm man, the invisible power, the subtle authority, and in quiet reflection, they made better decisions. A cruel joke left unsaid, a harsh word tempered, a small act of kindness offered instead of mockery. Each choice, small as it seemed, was shaped by the memory of that morning. And for Zeke, life moved forward, ordinary yet profound. He continued to sit on his bench, sip his tea, and observe the world, knowing that the lesson he had imparted, quietly, deliberately, with patience, had left an indelible mark. Not because of wealth, not because of force, but because truth, when met with calm authority and moral courage, carried power far beyond that of arrogance, ignorance, or cruelty. In the end, the resolution was simple yet profound. Ryan, Ethan, and Kyle carried the lesson forward, humbled but wiser. Zeke continued his quiet life, unchanged in routine but confident in impact. And the park, ordinary as it seemed, had become a classroom for life's subtler truths. Power is not always visible, wisdom is not always loud, and strength, often overlooked, manifests most deeply in patience, understanding, and the courage to teach without hatred. As the sun set over Willow Creek Park, casting long shadows across the grass, Zeke rose from the bench, cane in hand. He adjusted his flat cap, straightened his blazer, and walked slowly along the path, leaving behind the echoes of a lesson learned and the invisible imprint of a man who had quietly, irrevocably, shaped the hearts of 3 boys who would never forget the day they underestimated him. The park returned to its rhythm, birds chirping, children laughing, joggers passing, but the memory of that morning, of quiet authority, moral courage, and unseen power, lingered. For Zeke, it was another day in a life spent observing, guiding, and quietly shaping the world around him. For the boys, it was a turning point, a subtle, enduring awakening to humility, respect, and the invisible strength that sometimes sits quietly on a park bench, waiting to teach the world its lessons.